in terms of data journalism, what you see a lot is because there is a big fashion and an industry built around graphics and visualizations. There's a lot of consultancies that want to do work with ad agencies and big posters, where to a certain extent they're not interested in the data as a good and meaty story. They want to be able to build something creative from it and show something very fanciful and catch people's eye. So they often don't look for messy data. They often don't care so much about the source. They often get that source from almost like PR agencies, people who have cleaned and produced something, and they say they want to do it as a form of advertising. And so there's, in terms of data journalism, that's where the data journalism relates to what Nick Davies called journalism, where you're just processing something, you're just packaging it up. And there is a lot to be said for creativity and information flow and making things informative but also interesting. Though for the graphics desk at a lot of news agencies, but to pair it up with data journalism and to make it really core data journalism, I think a lot of that has to do with sourcing the information, investigating the information, and even knowing the story yourself, getting a leak, getting a tip off, suspecting something, and going and seeing whether there is a pattern in the data that you can show in a interesting human readable format rather than machine readable format, and get that story rather than just churning out something that has already been given to you as clean. Well, the way the news industry has been set up is the quality checks are for the end product to make sure that it fits on the page, that it's looking correctly on the page, the spelling is correctly, and everything is in its place. They trust solely to the journalists that they are doing the journalism correctly, that they are quoting a source which they have gone and interviewed and not lifting it from somewhere else. So with like the Johan Hari cases, you're seeing stuff coming up where they're realizing journalists are just lifting things. They're not doing the journalism. And also, again, in Nick Davies' books, he talks about the tendency to do this, or the dark arts, or a form of bad journalism, just because of the pressures and the lack of time which is given to journalists, which to a certain extent relates to data journalism again, that it's always been the case that you're only ever checked in retrospect if someone catches you out, if someone complains. More and more nowadays, it's easier to catch someone out, not from within the newsroom, but from outside the newsroom. People will, on Twitter, will then start approaching people. People will notice, because they have access to so much content, that the exact same quote appears in two different articles on two different dates and two different companies from different journalists, and they can say that you did not interview them at the time you lifted it. It's the same thing with the source of the data that you're given. A lot is done in terms of investigative, strong data journalism from organizations like ProPublica on government data, on public government data that's being produced because it should be in the public interest, but also government data isn't the cleanest. So a lot of the things that are very easy to do are not government data related, but something where someone has handed it to you. And that's something you should always question, rather than you pitching a story that's interview-based, saying, right, I think we should interview this politician because he's making a stance against a bill that's going through. We want to know why. We want to know, is it his constituencies and all the people voting for him have written a petition, let's go and interview him, rather than saying someone has approached me and says, I want you to interview me about my petition because I'm campaigning for something, and then you just doing that. It's not being approached by something because it's easiest. So to a certain extent, it's the same thing as sort of traditional journalism, but there is no checks and balances in any organization for it. They trust the journalist, and it's only when they're caught out by, the audience, by the people consuming it. And to a certain extent, it's very difficult to have a framework where you are checking everyone's workings. And at the end of the day, it just makes much more economical sense, business-wise, to make sure that the end result looks correct. But at the end of the day, you go to either journalism school, you get trained on the job, and you're being told that, with objectivity and impartiality, it's just doing your job correctly. So it is trusting the journalist as an individual. Yes, that's what I'm saying. Data journalism is journalism. So if you said, I am a document journalist, You'd be like, well, we always work with documents. Anything we record, interviews we record, things that we fall through, even stuff coming from the wires is always a document, which we then have to digest and package. This is the same thing with data journalism. It's just now, rather than the documents trickling in, it's the difference between the web and a library, in that because it's being digitized, it's coming out in a stream, there's just so much more of it. So different skills need to be had in order to sift through it. But the core, rather than the core abilities, the core values of it is exactly the same. Partiality, checking all your sources, making sure everything is correct, finding a top line, pitching things correctly, understanding your user base and what information they want, what stories they want, is the exact same. The only thing is different is that with data journalism, a certain ability to work with digital data, maybe computational data, and also a way of understanding where the tricks fall in, where the data, not necessarily could be lying to you, but could be misleading. It's the same thing as interviewing and reading a person, saying this person is giving me, he's giving me something because they're trying to manipulate me rather than actually giving me the truth. People have to pick that up in other people. When you deal with data and information, you need to get this sort of sixth sense of, I don't think something is very, very correct. The numbers here are too round. I need to make sure that I've got all the dates, everything is in here. The first things you should look at is not think as a data journalist, but just as a journalist, which is why a lot of developers and data scientists approach things to a certain extent from the wrong end. That what you need to do is, before you even do any sort of analysis or computation or look into something, is to pick up the phone. A lot of people, a lot of developers, data scientists don't like picking up the phone, but that's what traditional journalists do. You contact whoever has been logging this information, and you tell them, is this all you have? Because sometimes they split it between two sites. There's an older site, and you can gather information differently. Sometimes it's actually in a better format somewhere else, that they've aggregated it on another site that's already done your work for you. And also you can say, if that is the only source, you can try and say, well, do you do any analysis in aggregate numbers? So your total spending for the fiscal year, do you have that anywhere? So once you've actually gone and gotten that information, you can tot up that total and see whether it matches. And if you have a very wide discrepancy, you're either including something that you shouldn't do or something's missing, and you get onto them. Having some way of doing your checks and balances is a way of making sure that you're not wasting your time, that by the time you've done a lot of work and put a lot of work into it, that someone comes and says, actually, this isn't complete, or the data is actually from two different sources or two different fiscal years. We're going to have to go back all to the very, very beginning. So it's just the basic sort of journalism of can I double check that what I've gathered is correct, because that is what you're assuming, the information. You will build assumptions on that when you build your visualization, when you pull out your headline. You are assuming the content and the context of what you have. So you need to double check that those assumptions are correct from the offset. Yes, I looked into the data set. It was released on The Guardian, and nowhere, and a lot of people covered it, and nowhere in any of the written piece did they mention that in the transfer of that information to WikiLeaks, 1 month did not transfer properly, and that was completely missing from the war logs. And, in terms of the story, in terms of the deaths and the visualization, and in terms of actually saying that the leak itself was a story and it was important, it was very, very topical. But you should also, this is why, to a certain extent, nothing very, very quantitative was done from it. It was mostly qualitative. And it doesn't mean that you should shy away from something, but I think you should always disclose, especially when you're doing an all-capturing visualization, what is missing from it, if there is anything missing. And also as well, you can do things that interest people but trick their perception, and you've not necessarily done it on purpose. So, for instance, one of the latest thing was a company visualized all the meteor collisions with Earth, and it was done on how many we know there was, and then how many was observed. So it was the observed ones. And what it looks like is many more have hit in recent years. But that's not the case. It's just many more was observed because more and more people logged it and catalogued it. So to a certain extent, the movement builds a suggestion and that builds a story, but that might not be the case. It might be an artifact from the way it was collected or the assumptions or what is constrained in the data. And that's the story you should not tell. Your story should not be an artifact. Your story should be as near enough what it can tell you, including the assumptions and the limits. I would say it's fashionable. It's fashionable because a lot of the news industry have had a lot of pressure to become digital and digital first. And an interesting way of kind of embracing that is an interactive, because you're like, we can't do this in print. This is something we can only do that's digital. So it's been sort of the low-hanging fruit that people can grab at. There's a lot of organizations who have a lot of developers, especially designers and creative. It catches people's interest. It gets a lot of clicks. It gets a lot of eyeballs. But to a certain extent, that's fashionable because it's been the easiest thing that people can grab at straight away. But you're seeing stuff being built on top of it. And one of the leading people, of course, is the New York Times. And with Skyfall, where it wasn't just an interactive, it was kind of embedded and interwoven within the piece. And so people are trying to build on top of that. That is much more difficult, but you can't start off trying to do something like that. You have to start off with something that's easy and see how that fits in your system and your organization and how your users respond to it. To a certain extent, I think the fashion is going to die down in so much as it's not going to be seen as a great accomplishment for a news organization to be taking on board these graphic design consultant houses doing sponsored work for them anymore, just because now that's not, because we've got Skyfall and people are doing something different, people are going to know that this is the thing that's easy to do, and because it's fashionable, it only has a period in time before it gets old. And I think it's just about getting the journalists and getting the news organizations being able to handle something new, a new perception from their audience that isn't something read or listened to. And to a certain extent, the web, even though it looks two-dimensional, it's three-dimensional because you can wrap things behind it. You can reveal things behind it. Interactivity, movement is something that people are being able to understand more because we're interacting with tablets and things on a daily basis that isn't even news-related. And so I think once people realize that, the audience realize that, I think it's naturally going to become less and less fashionable. But it is still going to be a big struggle for organizations to be creative and to break boundaries. And I'm hoping that it is more story-based, that people are no longer building their story in their head and their perception for their medium because the medium is constraining. Rather, they're saying our medium is no longer constrained. Why don't we build our medium for the story? I liked it because its construction was quite simple. It's the sort of thing where you're kind of going, how come I haven't seen that before on some developer's blog? Someone else could have made that on their own with just these skills. The New York Times have tons of developers and fantastic editorial, and the construct was simple, but the fact that they had the idea to tell the story differently and to use things and put them together, that's sort of what I like about it, and I think that's what sort of got its Pulitzer. And what I think is important is that a lot of organizations have the misconception that what they build and their code and that product is what's of value, and that they have to hide that behind walled gardens. And that is not the case, because what we saw built there is nothing new. It can easily be done and actually redone on just scrolling and images. It's the conception of it. It's what they've learnt from actually building different things. It's the fact that that journalist didn't think of a traditional way of telling the story and harnessed the power, which is actually just quite simple elements of a web page, but it didn't look clunky, it didn't look detached. It was quite interwoven in the story. and it built on top of the story in terms of text. And the fact that it used a lot of different things, but had a flow to it and had a thought and understanding to it. It had an organic human construction to it in form of a narrative. And that's why I think it's really groundbreaking, not in that it used a massive library and they built lots of code on it and it did something which no computer can do, and it took pictures of people's faces and put them on the page or anything weird like that. It's actually just quite simple, but it goes to show that with just breaking the boundaries of understanding and sort of traditional concepts, you can actually make something really, really good, but using simple things. And the lowest common denominator, the key ingredient for that is not a developer, is not data skills, is not coding skills, it's not even a reputation for doing it. It's just that concept.